So, are we're live.
Well, I have a redirection page and yes. Okay.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi, Alexis. How are you?
I am very well. How are you, Dr. Rachel?
I'm doing really well, thank you.
I'm glad to hear. Now, you have a treat for us in store today, a very big topic that is particularly relevant today. I read on the front page of the Australian News this morning that the mental health pandemic is worse than expected, mental health crisis, particularly amongst teens. And the topic that you've chosen for today is very, very relevant. Would you like to introduce it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I hadn't read the front page of the Australian, but when you told me 10 minutes ago that the new data in suggests that it's worse than we thought, I quickly connected this topic today with this issue of teenage mental health. The topic for today being shame and shame resilience. We've had a couple of posts on our page in the last month on the topic of shame, and they were quite popular in terms of engagement with our audience. Many of our audience, our followers, are familiar with the work of Brené Brown, who studies shame and vulnerability and empathy, which are all connected topics, although at first you wouldn't quite know how, but we'll talk about it. And her work has been quite groundbreaking, but there have been other big names in this area of talking about the strong emotion of shame in human beings, right back to Charles Darwin, actually, who was one of the first scientists to recognize and study the human emotion of shame. And it's definitely a big and interesting topic because we're all prone to shame, which is, it's not a word that I find people use a lot, or they might use it on others. I remember Darren Hinch. Do you remember that show in the 80s? And Darren Hinch used to go, shame, shame, shame.
Yes, that's right.
We kind of know that it means that we're judging someone negatively. And perhaps we don't realize that when we judge ourselves negatively, that's the emotion we stir up in ourselves. And shame's an interesting topic because it doesn't have a facial expression that goes with it. Charles Darwin noted that.
Wow.
It has a body posture and a body expression, but it doesn't, like most emotions have a facial expression, but shame doesn't, because shame is the impulse to withdraw and hide ourselves away, to avoid further exposure, to more judgment. And shame is that experience where we go fuzzy-headed and get confused in our thinking, and we're awash with painful emotions, and we feel powerless, perhaps worthless. So we've all felt this emotion, but some of us have never named it.
So are you saying that there's no facial expression that Charles Darwin discovered? There's no facial expression because shame is the experience of withdrawing, pulling away. And so there's a bodily response with shame. Could you tell us a bit more about that so people can recognize when it's happening for them?
Well, it's a different emotion to anxiety and fear, but it's also got some similarities because stress hormones are released big time from the adrenal glands. Adrenaline, which most people have heard of, cortisol, although there's probably more cortisol, is my understanding, in shame. And cortisol is that passive stress hormone that makes us kind of want to freeze. So shame is a little bit more of that freeze response, the shutting down, whereas fear and anxiety is more of the activating response, wanting to fight or run. Shame makes us kind of shut down and want to freeze, want to hide, want to withdraw. But it still has similar physiology. Our heart rate goes up, our thinking is distorted, we get confused. But in shame, we may even actually, our shoulders may come forward. Some people experience it as a churning in their stomach, similar to anxiety. You know, we all know this warm wash of shame, feeling very self-conscious, feeling, you know, and it's usually mixed in with worry, confusion, and other emotions. Guilt is another one that it's often mixed in with. And pulling out the differences between shame and guilt is Brené Brown's work. And it's really interesting to see the differences between shame and other emotions. And like, you know, we go on about all the time in these Facebook lives and in our workshops and on our Facebook page, knowing the difference between your emotions and being able to name them is a crucial first step in being able to regulate them.
It's interesting as you talk about the body, and I'm fascinated to hear about how we distinguish shame from the other very similar emotions. But as you talk about the body, I can't help but think about the dog who knows when it's been told off and tucks the tail between the legs and again hunches over. I have to wonder whether we as mammals have a similar physiological response to contract and pull in.
Yeah, and Charles Darwin said this is an evolutionary response of mammals to keep us in the group. You know, for humans, children experiencing shame quickly learn what the norms are, what the rules are, and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So it serves an evolutionary function to keep the child kind of putting its tail between its legs, metaphorically, and its head down and sticking to the norms and the rules of the group in order to not get kicked out of the group, which would equal death. So it does have that primal quality about it. But by the time we're an older child or an adult, it's become quite subtle. We often don't necessarily show it, but internally we're experiencing that same impulse to run away, you know, hide ourselves and shut down. And so this is why we see shame as the root of depression quite often, because there's this depressing, this shutting down of the other feelings and of, you know, the true self in order to try and stay in the tribe and fit in.
So is that unique, the quality of the need for inclusion? Is that unique to shame, would you say, Rachel?
Well, shame is the fear that we don't deserve belonging and inclusion. So shame is like the fear of exclusion.
Yeah.
So it serves its function in childhood, like many of the other emotions. But the problem is, and shame is a unique, well, there's other social emotions, but shame is probably one of the strongest social emotions. So it's an emotion that's triggered through our relationships with others. You know, we can trigger our own shame if we sit in judgment of ourselves, but that's still in relationship to ourselves. So it's still a social emotion, as opposed to pure fear, which we might experience when we see a snake. That's not a social emotion. Shame is a social emotion. It helps regulate group behavior. But like anything in humans, like the stress response, the shame response can go haywire. You know, it served its function in our evolution, and it may have served its function in our childhood, helping us survive certain things by keeping the peace, you know, being quiet, being a people pleaser. But, you know, later on in life, it can lead to depression, addiction, eating disorders, you know, self-harm, low self-esteem. It can be underpinning perfectionism, you know, this fear of judgment and this fear that I'm not worthy of love and belonging. You know, this can get out of control and really make our lives difficult, make us suffer.
Absolutely. As you're speaking, it's reminding me of the social pressures under the existing conditions, you know, just wearing masks, for example. How would you encourage people to recognize when a subtle sense of shame may be helping them to adhere to group behaviours versus when they've internalized it and it's leading to those conditions you've described of depression, embarrassment, that deeper self-perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a few practices that just to make it really easy for people and simple. One of the things that I get my clients to ask themselves, because shame gets mixed in with fear and guilt and other emotions, I ask my clients to ask themselves if they're having a shame attack, because we can have shame attacks like we have anxiety attacks. I've had them. They're very normal, by the way. If you don't experience shame, I want to say this too. If you don't experience shame, you're probably a psychopath. So it's good to, you know, because shame comes from our ability to pick up on what other people are thinking, feeling, doing, what's the norm, what's not, what's kind of acceptable and not acceptable. So to some degree, we all, you know, like it's good that we are sensitive to other people. So if you're not, that's not good either. Right?
It's saying that it helps us to socially regulate.
Yeah, that's right. But the problem is when shame when it goes haywire, like any system in the body, you know, it's got its limits of usefulness, and then beyond that, it's not useful. So now I've lost my train of thought. You asked a good question. I asked
shame attack. How would you help someone distinguish when it's helpful versus not helpful?
When is their shame attack actually going way beyond its useful limits? So I ask my clients to ask themselves, have I actually done anything wrong? This is very common vernacular. You know what I mean by wrong.
Yes.
So, you know, I had a client the other day who, you know, had a few drinks, talked a lot. I could really kind of relate to her kind of judgment of I'm talking too much, because that's one of mine. And then she felt all this shame the next day. And I said, did you do anything wrong? And she said, no, not really. I said, okay, so you didn't actually do anything wrong. You didn't hurt anybody. You didn't, you know, say anything that was harmful in any way. She was just beating up on herself. She wasn't sure, but she plucked up the when she realized maybe she didn't need to feel shame anymore. Then we contemplated guilt. Did I maybe do something that's not quite in alignment with my values? So that's more guilt. Shame is I'm a bad person. Guilt is maybe I did something bad, in inverted commas, in other words, not lined up with my values. So she thought, you know, maybe I didn't ask enough questions of my friends. So she called one of them and said, you know, I'm a bit worried that, you know, I wasn't very mindful and I'm kind of being a bit hard on myself today. Did I talk too much, stay too long, to quote Tim Minchin? And her friend said, no, it was fine. We had fun. So she checked it out. She lost the shame, contemplated guilt, checked out the guilt with the friend. Her friend said, no, it was fine. Then she lost the guilt. But that was a really adaptive and appropriate way to handle it. But if she just stayed in all this shame and this judgment of herself, didn't reflect on her behavior, then she probably would have, I don't know, drunk a bottle of wine that night and stayed small and, you know, in her cocoon and just kind of ignored the problem and felt depressed perhaps. So asking, have I actually done anything wrong? And because then if your answer is yes, I have done something wrong, I really wish I hadn't done that thing, then you can make amends. You can go to guilt again and say, hey, I'm really sorry for that thing, you know, and then making amends, saying sorry, doing something to try and make it right is adaptive, useful, hopefully repairs the relationship. So guilt can be really useful, but shame in its pure form keeps us shut down, keeps us in low self-esteem, keeps us withdrawn.
Yeah, the withdrawal seems to be very unique to shame as well, which is probably why it's so dangerous. Because, like you say, the antidote of reaching out and receiving feedback can break that cycle. But if it's only inward, that sounds like it's a recipe for real self-harm.
Yeah, and at the base of self-harm and addiction and eating disorders and other self-destructive behaviors is often this really toxic buildup of shame. And so in therapy, we often work with this. And so, yeah, it's good to name it. That's the first step. And it's also the second step. And, you know, you just alluded to Brene Brown's shame resilience theory. So maybe we could go through those 4 steps.
Absolutely. And just to summarize that distinction between shame and guilt, Brene Brown talks about shame being, I am a bad person, I am a wrongdoer, versus I did a bad thing, or I made a mistake, you know, the behavior versus the identification.
It's such an important distinction. It's hard to tease it out sometimes because people go, well, I did this really terrible thing or I made this big mistake, and they quickly catapult back into, well, there must be something wrong with me. So we've got to do a lot of work sometimes to bring compassion to themselves for merely being a human being who's fallible, flawed, imperfect, you know, full of blind spots and shortcomings. But that's all of us, me too. And so this shared humanity piece in the self-compassion literature really comes into, you know, into play when we're looking at healing from shame.
Passion. Yes, so we've spoken about the context of shame being very relevant today, and how it's manifesting. And yes, I would really love to know what we would do about it. The shame resilience theory. You've mentioned the 4 steps, Rachel. What are they?
Yeah. So this is Brene Brown's work. So the 4 steps of shame resilience theory, which she put together. And I love this phrase, shame resilience, because again, it suggests that you can't get rid of shame. It's a human emotion. Let's just bounce back from it when we're in it. When we're hit with shame, let's try and find a way out. So step 1 is naming it. So realizing when your mind is full of negative self-evaluations and judgments and criticisms, that's shame. You're probably feeling bad about yourself. In very simple terms, when you're feeling bad about yourself, that's called shame. It doesn't have to be this ginormous front page kind of emotion, just that icky feeling when you're feeling bad about yourself. So naming it is step 1.
Right.
And also there's another part to step 1, which is being aware of the different areas of vulnerability, because she identified in her research, Brene Brown, 12 areas of vulnerability. I can never remember them all, but some of the obvious ones are body image and the body. We all know how easy it is to have shame around your body and your bodily functions.
Bodily functions is an interesting point. Just even, simple basic functioning, there can be shame around how the bowel moves. I mean, that alone is fascinating.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, carry on.
No, but it's a good point, because often as children are often shamed for bodily functions, for their weight, for their height, for other physical features, even for eating, even don't eat with your mouth open, even that can create a moment of shame for a child, and they're just being an innocent kid, so framing things positively in parenting, which is a whole other Facebook Live, but can help minimize how much shame our children experience. But we probably all got some of that growing up. So the shame around the body.
Yes.
There's shame around mental health. We all know this, because it's so hard to say, I'm taking antidepressants, or it's so hard to say I struggle with anxiety, let alone more severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar, eating disorders. There's a lot of shame around those sort of things, which breaks my heart as a psychologist, because, my clients are always, as I'm sure yours are, beautiful, lovely, smart people who are just suffering. They're struggling. So that's another area, is mental health. Education and career is another area of vulnerability. And you can see how all of this is comparison based. If I compare myself to someone else, I'm likely, if I don't feel arrogant and better than, which is the flip side, then I could easily feel less than and not good enough. And then there's other areas of vulnerability to shame, like parenting. As parents, we all know how vulnerable we might be to feeling bad. And wealth, and there's a whole lot of them, but the common ones are body and mental health and physical health. You can look it up online. But so we need to know which area we're vulnerable to shame, because some of us are more vulnerable to shame in one area or a couple of areas. The second step to shame resiliency is to apply critical awareness. So to zoom out and look at how the culture, maybe the culture of our larger family or our school or culture at large, how it feeds shame. Like media, movies, social media, all of these like large scale kind of shame induced, like the messages that we get. Everybody knows this, right? We've all seen beautiful models and we've thought, my thighs are too spongy or something. I don't know. Like, again, it's the comparison thing. I'm not as good as, not as pretty as, not as smart as, not as successful as. So it's this. So we've got to zoom out and kind of also ask the question, who benefits from my shame?
Wow.
A lot of industries benefit from shame. We make a lot of money from our shame. So if you want to be a bit subversive, you might consider not spending out of shame about your body or something else. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So applying critical awareness, so looking at the big picture. The third step of shame resilience is to connect with another, find a safe, trusted person. Because when we speak our shame, when we say, I'm feeling bad, I'm judging myself. And when someone hears that with compassion or with empathy and doesn't judge us, but accepts us and normalizes it and gives us love or care or empathy, this starts to melt away the shame. We can be seen in our humanity as just a human being who struggles. Everybody. So step 3 is reach out and connect with safe people. Step 4 is build community. So kind of keep this conversation going, deconstruct shame, because there's an argument that some shame is healthy. Perhaps that's what Charles Darwin seemed to think to a point, but I think it's very limited in its healthiness. And most of the time, shame is not helping you. It's not helpful, useful or helpful. And it's so much better to see if we can convert it to guilt and then use the guilt to make amends if that's necessary, or see, actually, there's no reason to feel guilty. I don't need to feel shame or guilt. I'm okay. Everything's okay. So step 4 is really just to kind of keep the conversation going around this topic and build community where we feel accepted and not judged.
Yes. Wow, I love that. Naming it. Okay, so I can recognize I might be feeling a bit hunched. I recognize I'm feeling bad about myself. I can identify shame. Which area am I noticing that? I might need to keep a radar to that particular area around body, around my finance, around parenting. I might just need to just be a bit extra compassionate, extra careful, noticing the messaging. That is so powerful. I haven't heard that before, but so helpful to identify that it's coming from outside. It's not even an internal experience. It belongs, almost like giving it back to whoever's projected it. And then connection, of course, and you spell out how simple that can be, Rachel, to just even say, I'm feeling this, helping to get that feedback and normalizing, and community, which is, of course, so critical at this very point in time. So necessary for all of us to feel that we are in safe, held relationships.
That's it, safe community. Some of my clients are in 12-step programs, and many of them have really lauded positively the benefits of being in a community where they feel accepted, not judged. It melts away their shame so they can relax and open up.
Yes, yeah, actually similarly, and the safe relationship of the sponsor, that seems a critical component. And again, that would be due to the empathy dissipating the shame. Just even one person to hold a non-judgmental space can help to dissolve that restriction and withdrawal. Yeah, that's a beautiful connection. Thank you.
Have we got any? Thank you for that.
That's a great question. I'm just about to have a look.
Because I'd love to answer people's questions if people have any, or here's some comments about how you've been affected or on this journey of understanding what shame is and how to work with it.
Yeah, how shame is manifesting. So I'm seeing 12 engagements. I'm not seeing a lot of comments today, only 4. There's a few likes, there's some loves, there's definitely people watching. We've reached over 100 people, but I'm not seeing a lot of comments. So please do ask any questions. You've got access here to Dr. Rachel. It's a treat to have you talk about such an important topic. And it would be, it's kind of ironic that there's fewer comments around shame. It does indicate how our culture is less vocal about this particular emotion.
Have you watched, it's so true, have you watched the TED Talk called Listening to Shame by Brene Brown?
No, I don't know that one. I may have, but I don't recognize the name.
It's called Listening to Shame. It's her Brene Brown's second TED Talk. I'll put it in the comments later. Yeah. And she makes a joke that whenever she sits down on an airplane and the person next to her says, so what do you do? And she goes, I'm a shame researcher. And I see you. And then the person next to her just is like, oh, I don't know what to say next.
Yeah.
It's not a sexy topic, it's a hard thing to talk about.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I identified the feeling of shame in myself was probably only about 8 or 9 years ago. And then when I had a word for it, I was like, oh, this is shame. And now I'm scared. So fear can precede shame because we don't want to feel shame. And then we feel shame, but then we feel afraid of speaking our shame. So fear and shame kind of go in each other's footsteps. Yeah. And it was with my husband who'd said something I interpreted as a criticism. When we were at the markets one Sunday morning, we got home and I said, please, 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 please don't take this as a criticism of you. But I feel this shame stuff coming up. And then I asked him what his need was underneath what he said. And I expressed what my need was to be received in my innocent intentions. I perceived that he'd sort of interpreted my behavior not as innocent, but as arrogant or something. And I felt like my intentions were quite innocent. So my need was to be seen and accepted. But I wondered what his need was in making the criticism. And so then we had a conversation about needs that kind of bypassed the criticism, and it helped my shame sort of dissipate, and I kind of relaxed. And I also felt very proud of myself for identifying the feeling and talking about it a little bit.
Yes, the language is invaluable. I loved shame attack. I'm sure I will be using that. I've seen myself concerned with meeting the social norms, the social behaviors, especially in the current context, but going over that and hearing myself saying, oh, I really should have done that, really I could have done that, and recycling that. I'm going to name it as a shame attack.
Yeah. And should is the shaming word, right?
The red flag.
Yeah. The two SHs, shoulds lead to shame. So remember that if you're shoulding on yourself, I should have done this, I shouldn't have done that, you're probably having a minor shame attack. And that's okay. That's human. You're not a psychopath. Well done. But you don't want to live there. You want to move past it. So you want to follow these steps of kind of like zooming out, applying critical awareness, giving yourself some kindness and acceptance, maybe finding someone to talk to about it, speak it out so you can, get some empathy for your experience. All of this is going to help. Now, I noticed there's a couple of questions now on the
yes. Anissa Beck says, I had uncontrolled epilepsy for 9 years. My kids suffered. It was tough and I felt guilty. First 3 kids understood. My fourth has pre-borderline personality disorder. I've learnt not to feel shame or guilt. I did my best and I love the children, but it's painful still. Yeah.
Well done, Anissa.
Yes, the pain is, we talk a lot in our workshops around compassion, about being with the pain. It sounds like Anissa's sharing that need to build tolerance to our experiences, which, when you mentioned the word shame resilience, that's what it occurred to me, that we also need to build a bit of resilience to the feeling of shame in a way, to building tolerance and compassion within it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think tolerance is a really good first step, then acceptance. And then if you want to go advanced, bring compassion to it.
No.
It sounds like that's what, Anissa, you've been able to do. I did my best. That is such a great antidote. I'm doing my best, or I did my best. It's true. I believe we're all doing our best. I don't know if that's true because I'm not inside everyone else's head, but my life certainly works better if I believe that everybody's doing their best.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, there's one more question there. Can you see that from Kirsten?
Yeah, there's a few. I'm curious to know how people with ASD can show shame or remorse, to how they can show shame or remorse to someone they've hurt. They are able to verbalize it to people, but to the person they have hurt, they can't. Have you any experience with that, Rachel?
Well, I have a lot of experience with people with ASD. I have a child with ASD. And I think if I understand your question, Kirsten, you're saying they can verbalize it to people, but to the person they've hurt, they can't. I mean, I think there's a lot of fear. It is first of all, I want to normalize this for you. It's very scary to approach somebody who you care about. and say something as simple as, you know, I'm disappointed in how I acted or overreacted earlier. You know, I don't feel good about it, or I feel bad about it. Like, there's everyday ways to talk about this feeling. You don't have to use the word shame. You don't have to, right? And to get in touch with the fact that you feel disappointed in your own actions or choices, and to speak from that place, even if it's just, I'm sorry. And maybe an acknowledgement of, you know, that must have hurt you. Or ask them, did you feel hurt when I said blah, 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 or when I did blah, blah, blah? So sometimes it's just a few words. The hard part is connecting with your own disappointment in your own choices, and then speaking from that, because the word sorry and the word sorrow mean the same thing. So sorry is just our sorrow, our sadness.
I feel sorry.
At how we've behaved. You know, I feel sad that I acted that way, that I yelled at you, that I didn't tell you the whole truth, that whatever the behavior is, you know, I feel some sadness around that, and I'm sorry. Sorry is sorrow.
That's a beautiful connection. Thank you for that, Rachel. It sounds like Kirsten might have someone close to her with ASD, and she's on the receiving end of someone finding that they can't apologise, is how I'm reading it. But Kirsten, feel free to give us some more context there. Helen Green is asking whether self-esteem is the same as shame, or feeling a low self-esteem.
Yeah, great question. I've wondered about this a lot, Helen. I think they're distinct concepts. I think I have reasonably good self-esteem these days, but I still experience shame. So I don't think they're the same thing. But I think that a lot of shame that we're not working with or working through turns into low self-esteem, because low self-esteem is like a generalized global negative view of yourself, or a negative feeling towards yourself. Esteem means feeling, right? Or feeling with an opinion or perception. I looked it up a while ago. So I think if you're not working with shame consciously, you'll end up with low self-esteem. And so when people come to my office saying, I want to work on my self-esteem, and we unpick that, what exactly does that mean for you? But then often we're looking at, how do you beat up on yourself? How do you judge yourself? How do you react and feel when you do that? Okay, let's work with that. You know, let's normalize that. Let's name that. Let's zoom out and look at where that all comes from. Like you said so beautifully, Alexis, is there some of that we can just give that back? That's not even yours. And then can we work with the mind, work with the body, self-compassion practices, identifying needs, owning and legitimizing our very valid needs. There's so many things we can do to work with shame and increase our self-esteem.
So are you saying that if someone recognizes that they have low self-esteem, that there may be some underlying shame?
Oh, always. Yeah. So experiencing shame doesn't mean you've got low self-esteem, but if you've got low self-esteem, shame will be the fuel. Shame will be fueling that for sure.
A beautiful connection. Meg says that I had 2 abusive relationships, one for 20 years and one for 3. The last one accused me of using him as much as he had been using me, of using him as much as he had been using me.
People got her intentions so wrong. Yeah.
It's hard to get to 47 realizing people got my intentions so wrong. Okay, this goes back to your story about acknowledging the innocence of the intention and clarifying that if necessary.
Yeah.
What suggestions do you have for Meg, or any feedback on that?
It's first of all, I just want to acknowledge it is very painful, you know, and there's almost always gaslighting in abusive relationships. So the other person is telling you that you've done the wrong thing and that you're crazy and all this sort of stuff to destabilize you and kind of have you doubting yourself. That keeps you disempowered. But of course, at some point we have to own that we let ourselves be disempowered and we stayed in that powerless place because we didn't know what else to do. There's an innocence in that as well. You know, when we teach people compassionate communication or needs-based communication, we're always emphasizing repeatedly that your needs are valid, your needs are innocent, your needs are universal human needs. You may not always express them very well because you may not be conscious of them, But again, if you choose to believe that people are always doing their best, because life tends to work better if you live from that philosophy, I've found, then you have to kind of remember that you're doing your best and you've done your best. And I think it was Maya Angelou who said, when you know better, do better. But until that point, you can't be angry at yourself for not knowing what you didn't know until you knew it. Self-forgiveness and self-compassion, and take the learning, but leave the shame behind. Ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Not what should I have done differently. You want to have that forward focus, not the backward shame-based focus.
And just to close Kirsten's comment about someone she knows with ASD, she's protecting their story, which is a beautiful and important thing to do. So thank you for that. Helen says, thank you, so informative and helpful. Thank you very much, Rachel. Really important topic. I feel like we could talk about this one over and over again, but it is time to wrap it up. We have had a positive feedback from our breathing in a square. Would you like to close with one square together? How does that sound to you, Dr. Rachel?
I would, and I'd like to connect this self-regulation square breathing exercise to shame, just to say that when we're in a shame attack, we get fuzzy-headed, the mind gets very confused, our heart rate goes up. So any self-regulation technique like square breathing helps you get back to calm so that you can think clearly again. It helps a lot.
Yeah, actually, that's a wonderful point. Thank you. You can use this one when you notice a shame attack. Even a single square can be enough to break the cycle. So I invite you either to lower or close your eyes and let go of a breath as it feels natural to do so. So that together we can breathe in 2, 3, 4, and we can hold it in 2, 3, 4, and we can breathe out together 2, 3, 4, and we can hold the breath out 2, 3, 4. And as your breathing returns to normal, you can notice the influence even of a single controlled breath in facilitating your own self-compassion, your own self-awareness, your own self-regulation. And I'd like to thank you again for tonight, Dr. Rachel, and I look forward to seeing you again same time next week.
Thank you, Alexis. Yes, and I would like to let everyone who's still watching know that if they would like one-on-one support with breath work, conscious breathing, body work, yoga, and a variety of self-regulation techniques, they could go to your website if they want to focus on that. You're in Brisbane as well, and your website is onenaturaltherapies.com.au. So I wanted to say thank you to you and let everyone know how they can get in touch with you as well.
Thank you, Dr. Rachel. Yes, I feel honoured to work one-on-one with my clients, and I feel also honoured to have your supervision in facilitating that. So yes, please do reach out. We know now that the body is essential in healing, and the mind, of course, the mind and the body together are essential. So yes, please do reach out, and I'll leave just a link to my Facebook page in the comments, and look forward to hearing from you all again next week.
Next Sunday. Yes. Thank you, Alexis. Thanks, everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you. Okay.
Bye for now.
Bye.